but I am pleased right now to welcome our next guest, which is Namrata Goswami. Dr. Goswami is an independent scholar on space policy, great power politics, and ethnic conflicts. She teaches at Thunderbird School of Global Management, Arizona State University, and a guest lecturer, Technology Society and Governance and India Today class, Emory University. After earning her PhD in International Relations, she worked as a research fellow at the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, New Delhi. She has been a visiting fellow at Peace Research Institute, Oslo, Norway, La Trobe University, Melbourne, Australia, and University of Heidelberg in Germany. From 2012 to 2013, she was a Jennings Randolph Senior Fellow at the United States Institute of Peace in Washington, D.C., and was awarded a Fulbright Nehru Senior Fellowship. In 2016, she was awarded the Minerva Grant awarded by the Office of the U.S. Secretary of Defense to study great power competition in outer space. In April 2019, Dr. Goswami testified before the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission on China's space program. She also has a book, The Naga Ethnic Movement for a Separate Homeland, Stories from the Field, which was published by Oxford University Press of March 2020. Her co-authored book, Scramble for the Skies, The Great Power Competition to Control the Resources of Outer Space, was published October 2020 by Lexington Press, an imprint of Rowman and Littlefield. She gave TEDx talk explaining her work and life at the Rosa Parks Museum in Montgomery, Alabama, and currently she is working on 2 book projects on space power and China's grand strategy. Dr. Goswami, we're so happy to have you today, and we're very excited to hear your story and start your conversation.
Thank you, April. April, there is a sound of a lawn mower. Can you hear it? I'm so sorry.
Oh, this is Meredith. April.
Oh, Meredith, can you hear it? At my background, there's a huge lawn mower. I'm in an Airbnb and they are decided to clean up the entire front yard. Is it coming through, the sound?
I think you sound great. So yeah, just keep doing you and we should be fine.
Okay, Meredith, thank you so much. And thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm sorry I missed your name. I was so nervous with that lawn. So forgive me for that.
All good.
So what I'm going to do today, and I was really happy to listen to Sensei Dave Armstrong's presentation, especially what he and Inara pointed out, that it really doesn't matter where we are from or where we come from. What matters is what we bring to a particular conversation, including what we bring from our experience. And so before I give my presentation, I would like to point out that I grew up in a very small town in Northeast India, which is one of the remotest areas of India. And I remember when I was young, we would lose power a lot of times, and we would actually go without any electricity for a week or so. And despite that, we as children had so much excitement about the stars and what it meant. And so I think that particular experience and growing up in these remote mountains continue to inform my work. And so I think that's why our experiences are so critical. So let me just share my screen here. So today, when you think about what I'm working on, so as Meredith pointed out, I'm working on 2 book projects. One is on great power politics and looking at especially how China views space from a grand strategic perspective. But I'm also looking at how different nations, for example, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, the United Arab Emirates, Nigeria brings to the table in terms of what are their perspectives in regard to space and the futures that they want to actually envision. So in my faculty role at the Thunderbird School of Global Management, what I teach my students is this graph. So when you think about the space policy process, what I have noticed across different societies, cultures, as well as different states, is that first, societies identify a particular problem. And by problem, it's not what you think about from a human problem perspective. They identify a problem in terms of what technology is required? What is the technology going to bring to that particular society? And once they identify the problem, which is a lack of a particular technology, for example, an independent launch system, say if you want to go to Mars or the moon, they then go about forming a policy. So it's really critical, if you think about it from the United States perspective, that problem identification, why are you interested in a particular space goal? What does it bring to your society? What does it bring to your national security? What does it bring to your diplomacy? It's really critical to identify. Because if you do not have an identification of a problem, you might end up investing on the wrong missions and might not have that long-term advantage the particular society might get, especially democratic societies. Then once you have a policy formulation, it's really critical to see how it gets adopted. So which institutions adopt it. For example, when the US established a policy for a separate space force, it was then adopted by the Department of Defense, and then it resulted in a separate space service. A very similar story can be told about NASA. And then finally, you look at policy implementation. So it's not enough to have identification. It's not enough to have just formulation or adoption. You also have to have an implementation process. And finally, you have to evaluate your policy. That is, how effective has that policy been? And also in terms of how that impacts a particular society or a state. So in context, keeping that in mind, how does the US space program bear out today, and what is the focus of the United States space program in the future? So what I have noticed from different space documents in the US, starting from the junior Bush administration to the Obama administration, followed by the Trump administration, and now with the Biden administration, within the US, there is a growing recognition that space is a very critical enabler of infrastructure for society across the United States. And so there is a growing focus on space development and utilization. This is different from the Cold War, where space was about prestige and showcasing a particular technological capability vis-a-vis another nation. So that's a very critical pattern. Second, and this is something that is growing across different administrations, there is an increasing focus on cislunar space, which is the space between the Earth and the moon. So the United States under the Biden administration just released a cislunar strategy where they argue that the awareness of the moon, space situational awareness, looking at whether you can have economic return from the moon, is going to be a very vital part of space futures. And that's something that is new. The moon was before viewed as a place where you go to and come back. Today, the US is actually pointing out that the moon becomes a critical component of a pit stop, if I may, to get to Mars. And then, as I said before, there is civilian focus, a lot of focus on infrastructure, given the fact that we use space for GPS, navigation, ATM transactions, e-education. So there is a growing focus in that regard. Then there is a huge focus on commercialization. In fact, the United States today has one of the most advanced commercial space sector. We have our own independent reusable launch capability. We have the ability to have imagery from space to commercial sector. And also now there is the interesting policy implementation stage where NASA is giving out commercial contracts to US commercial companies to develop the moon from business or profit-making perspective, but also through the Artemis Accord, there is a push to show how we can actually benefit others as well. And then finally, there is a huge push for space regulation and space norm building, including a push for banning anti-satellite weapons. So that's how the US space program has evolved in the last few decades. Now, I also studied China. And so if you look at China's space program, China views space as a part of their grand strategic thinking, by which they argue that space is a very critical component of national strategy. It's very critical for their power projection. And so that's a shift that has happened in the last few years. In Chinese strategic culture perspective, investment in space is a legitimate and a very important national security investment. So space is critical for China's ability for nuclear command and control, for navigation, for sending out troops or unmanned underwater vehicles, for example, in the Taiwan Strait. And then space is also viewed as a critical part of regime legitimacy, national security, and economic development. Now, in comparison to the US, China differs. So unlike the US, where there is a very clear demarcation of what is civilian space, what is commercial space, and what is military space, and the US has different institutions pushing for that, the China's space program does not have that kind of demarcation. So they have a civil military fusion strategy where they view space as a part of their military, commercial, civilian capability, and they do not have institutions that separate that. So under China's space program, space is actually mandated, determined, and led by the State Council of the Communist Party of China. And then the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, is in charge. Now, another country which is a very critical spacefaring nation is, of course, India. And if you look at India's space program, one of the most advanced in terms of Asian space powers, India also has a very interesting grand strategy. So space is viewed as something that develops India's society, deals with concepts like weather forecasting, agriculture, helping farmers to understand where they can actually have crop yield, given weather patterns. So India's space program is viewed from developing India's societal capability. Now, why is this critical for India? So Pew Research Institute and others point out that India is the largest population today. It has overtaken China and will have the most youthful population by 2035. So people between the age of 15 and 25, India will dominate. So in that context, developing space, building space entrepreneurship, developing space from a commercial perspective is becoming a critical focus for India. So similar to China, India also has drivers for space. So nationalism plays a very key part. India feels very proud when they achieve something in space. For example, the first Asian country to get to Mars in 2014. And so those achievements matter. But what is even more important is that today, India is articulating its space program from a commercial perspective. So when India rationalizes a mission to get to low Earth orbit with humans, the minister who is responsible for that particular space program argues that this is about space tourism. This is about developing that capability. And India is very similar to the US. Unlike China, civilian, commercial, and military space programs are separate. So they're led by separate institutions, and there is no fusion vis-a-vis China. Now, India and the US has a very strong partnership. Recently, the Biden administration agreed to upscale space collaboration, including what is the most interesting development. NASA is going to consider Indian commercial companies for their lunar program, and in fact, to develop lunar capability. So that's something that is a new development in the last few years. Finally, before I open up for an interaction with Meredith and the audience, middle powers. So there are countries that do not have the capability that the great powers have, for example, China, India, or the US. But middle powers also play a very critical role. So United Arab Emirates has one of the most advanced space programs. They want to build a city on Mars by 2117. And their argument is that even if we don't achieve it, what we are going to achieve is developing our youth and our scientific temper that will have many spin-off space technologies. Luxembourg, which is a middle power in Europe, has the most advanced space mining legislation that they established in 2017 that enables a company that sets up shop in Luxembourg to actually benefit. Japan, I think, is going to change the game this year. So a Japanese company called iSpace is on its way to the moon as we speak. And they're going to attempt the first commercial landing on the moon by April. And guess what they're doing? They're actually extracting resources on the moon and selling it to NASA as in a pre-agreed contract. And the argument is that that is going to open up the moon for business. And so if they succeed, they're going to become the first commercial entity supported by a Japanese space mining that actually solves the problem of ownership as well. So Japan's mining legislation says that if a company can extract resources and can keep it, they own it. And so it resolves some of the issues that international regulations have. Now, United Kingdom and Saudi Arabia just agreed to develop space-based solar power together. You know that Saudi Arabia has exited the Moon Agreement, which means that they will also build a business case for the Moon, and the Moon Agreement does not enable some of the private sector activities. And finally, Australia. Australia is also hoping to take advantage of the future in space and is building their own spaceports, has established a separate space agency, and wants to play a very critical role in determining the space regulations and the norms of responsible behavior in space. I think the United Kingdom is where a great example of building normative frameworks to ensure that given the great power competition as to who is going to control the resources of outer space, there is concern that it might lead to militarization of space. And so the United Kingdom has actually built a proposal at the level of the United Nations General Assembly called 7635 that is about ensuring that space is not militarized. And they have several countries that have agreed to have that conversation with them. So finally, what are implications? So since I deal with implications in terms of US space policy and national security, and Inara and Sensei Dave had spoken to this as well, I think what is critical is that the US space policy is about civilian development, about going to Mars, about developing the Moon. But what is important is that there are also implications if the United States does not have the capability to deter or to secure their assets in low Earth orbit or geosynchronous orbit, given the fact that both China and Russia have anti-satellite weapons. And as you know, both of them have tested it, and the Ukraine conflict tells you how much strategic collaboration is there between them. And so the first implication is that the United States needs to have that capability to secure its civilian assets in space in case there is an escalation of conflict. Second, the United States really needs to have an industrial vision and a vision of economic development of cislunar space, because what is important in the future is which particular political regime, democratic, representative, inclusive, or a very close authoritarian system will lead that particular discourse. And so the US really needs to have that game in terms of what vision they want to offer. Finally, the United States is a great power. So whatever conversations in terms of national security or space the US has, the audience is not just Americans. I think there is sometimes a misunderstanding that the conversations we have or the policy high-level conversation, the audience is the US electorate. Actually, almost all countries follow the United States in terms of its discourse and are curious as to how the US is going to offer that particular inclusive future. And so that has to be always kept in mind when the US either establishes a space force or whether it establishes a space policy vision, that the audience is international. So I think I'll stop there and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Great. That's so interesting. And, you know, I think what's the best thing about these conversations is they always can go in so many different directions, and we can clearly feel your passion behind this. So I guess my question for you, I'll start the conversation, and then of course, everyone else that's on here and watching, we've got about 12 more minutes. So jump in, let's get some more of these conversations going. What is your best advice for people that, you know, want to get more involved? Because as we know, there's so many ways people can get involved, whether it's participating in an event like this or actually going out and doing something. But for somebody that may just be on the brink of interest, because we know a lot of people are just getting bitten by the space bug, what would your interest be to kind of follow what you're doing and to get more and more into this thing we're creating?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. And I think this is the right time for more people to get involved, because there is this explosion of a desire for democratizing space, right? Going beyond just a few astronauts to opening it up. So there are three ways that anybody can contribute more. One is that there is a lacunae in terms of skills, right? And by skills, I mean, there is a great demand. And I have seen this in my travels across different nations, that nations are starting to develop space as a critical infrastructure, as an inspirational goal. And they're looking for young people to join them, not just from STEM, but from any field, right? I am not educated in STEM. My background is social science. So there are different ways. So first, you can be an engineer, you can be a rocket scientist and contribute to a space program. Or you can be a policy person who studies space policy. Or you can be someone who wants to set the agenda. For example, if Meredith, you are interested in how the US space program should be conceptualized, you can write about it, you can give speeches, you can actually write to Congress. So that's the first way. The second way is more on the ground, right? So one area where there is a huge demand for contribution is space law. And so we talk a lot about space engineering, space rocket, but without regulation, space will not take off because regulations can be very limiting across all nations. So I think to understand that, what we can do is create more educational awareness, as well as create, for example, a process through which US regulations, Chinese regulations, Nigerian regulations are understood, because space is, after all, a province of humankind, right? And then finally, I would say my third point is that if you are passionate about space, and I've seen this in my conversations across the world, you have to pick your niche area, right? What do you bring to the table? So if you are good in art, what do you bring to the table, right? If you're good in science, which area in science you want to contribute to? Not everybody can be a launch company, right? There is a supply chain, so identify that. And I think those are the ways that there could be much more contribution. And as Sensei Dave was mentioning, the Space Force, right? So when the Space Force was established, I have my students across the US who wants to know how to contribute and become a member of the Space Force, right? So those are the kind of ways you can contribute more.
I think you hit it on the head with all of that. I mean, every single person out there, we're all connected to space in one way or another. And I think you're absolutely right. You don't have to be somebody in STEM. You don't have to be someone who went to school and studied stuff in space. You can take what you already know, what you're already passionate about, and contribute that to the space business. For example, I'm a journalist in addition to a scientist as a meteorologist, but now I'm seeing more and more the importance of storytelling, and as a scientist, using my science background to break down these very comprehensive topics, but make it easy to understand to get more and more people inspired. Another great question that came in here from Tim: is there a right way to build a space industrial base that will support the preservation of a free and fair space economy?
That's the great question. I start with vision. So first, you have to have the vision, right? So what is it that you want to achieve? So, okay, you're developing a space industrial concept, you're building your satellite constellations, you're building your reusable capability, you're building your societal skill set. But what is the end goal, right? Why are you doing that? And that clarity, the US still doesn't have today in the post-Cold War, right? And so to build the space industrial capability in the right way, a space vision of national imagination, international collaboration and vision is number one. Second, it is really important to understand what can be supported in the entire supply chain, right? So space engineering, space development requires a supply chain that would require very niche capability. So that's number two, identify. So, and as there is where all of us can contribute, right? I can contribute from my social science policy perspective. You can contribute from your meteorological understanding of what your background is, right? Inara can contribute from her own experience. And so that's the second. And finally, I would say that when you have such industrial capability vision, you have to also identify priority areas, right? It can't be this amorphous industrial vision that not many people can understand, right? So you have, for example, the Artemis program. Okay, you want to achieve permanent settlement on the moon. What is it that we have to do today and tomorrow to get to that vision by 2026? So that's how I would see it.
Oh, that's great. Looks like a few more questions coming in. So by the way, everyone that's watching today, thank you so much for joining the conversation and keeping this going. So this one actually coming in from Elizabeth Wallace, who's watching. How optimistic are you that the United States would have a unified vision for commercialization and asset protection? What are the challenges?
Yeah, so I actually think that so one of my biggest critique of the United States space policy over the decades was that there wasn't that unified vision, right? So during the Cold War, it was very easy to have a unified vision because you had this very systemic level adversarial contacts and narrative, the Soviet Union vis-a-vis the US. So a vision for unified vision was there. Today, it is much more difficult, but what is emerging because of critique is that across different administrations, I see the usage of similar language. I see the push for commercial development of space. I also see a growing desire from society to support a commercial development of space, right? And what is most inspiring to me is that when I talk to my...
Hi, can you please, not speaking, can you please mute your thing? Thank you very much. Okay, go on.
Thank you. So, and then finally, what is most inspiring to me is that there is also the push for developing the normative regulatory capabilities when it comes to commercial unified vision, right? And so finally, I would say that space is something that is long, and it's something that requires long-term investment, by which I mean money. And so a commercial vision that is unified, that is long-term across different administrations, across different commercial sectors is really critical. And that's where I think commercial industry could have an advantage, because despite the fact that they depend on funding, they can also have long-term vision capability and building.
Great. A few more questions coming in. This next one also coming in from LinkedIn from Nino. He was asking about how you support such forums such as OSD Space Policy-led DTIP Future Innovation Forum, reaching 5,000 plus SES CIOs and flag officers, kind of how you would support that.
So how would I support what? Recruitment, policy? What is the question?
Nino, if you're on, if you want to hop on and ask your
Yeah.
question, I'm trying to read that here. It's a good question.
Yes, so I want to understand before I answer it.
Let's see. I don't know. Let's see here. I think. Let me just read it again what it says. I would love to discuss an OSD space policy-led DTIP Future Innovation Forum on top of our current dynamic forums to tackle all you discussed, reaching 5,000 plus SES CIOs and flag officers.
Okay.
Support such a forum.
Oh yeah, sure. Yes. Okay, I got it. So I think that would be a useful institutional step, right? So if you have a forum that can reach out to futuristic space policy that actually is focused on flag officers and what their needs are and what they can bring to the table and include them in the conversation, I think that's going to build institutional capability, interest, and a culture as well, right? And I'll give an example from the real world where I have participated in such futuristic forums, right? So one is I participated in the US Space Force workshops on Space Futures 2060. And what was inspirational was that this workshop that was actually funded by the Space Force included participation from academia, from Space Force officers, from Air Force officers, from Marine Corps officers, from independent scholars like me. And they actually looked to the future in 2060 and what end goal and what inspirational state you would want to focus on, and what could different entities bring, including the Space Force officers themselves. So yes, I am absolutely supportive of a forum that would look to the future in that regard, in such specific capabilities and detail.
Great. And then I think we have time for one more question. Elizabeth was also asking if you can explain the legislation in Japan that you were talking about. She says it doesn't seem like democratization. I don't know why I can't talk this morning. It doesn't seem like democratization of space.
Okay, so Japan in December of 2022, beg your pardon, established a space mining legislation. This has been in the process for some time. And so what the Japanese space mining legislation does is that it establishes a process of how a company can ask for a license to go to a particular celestial body, not necessarily always the moon, and extract resources. And then the Japanese space legislation makes it clear that the company that is actually able to do that can keep the resources that they mine. Now, what is even more interesting from the Japanese position is that they point out that the Outer Space Treaty does not allow national appropriation or sovereignty, but it does not stop you from utilization of space, right? And so the Japanese argument is that we are actually building into the democratic process by offering companies an ability to do a utilization business, project, and do it in a democratic regulatory way. And we are also meeting our Outer Space Treaty obligation, right? So in the Outer Space Treaty, the words utilization is there, and there is nothing in the Outer Space Treaty that stops you from extracting a resource and keeping it. The only thing it does not allow is that a Japanese company goes to the moon and says, this area on the moon is our sovereign territory. You cannot do that, right? And that's why some of my research, including my conversations with colleagues across the world, is that how do we make that process more fair, right? Because today, the country and the company with the most capable economic resources can do it. There could be a first term advantage, right? And they can keep the resources, and some of the resources like iron ore, platinum are worth trillions of dollars, And so how do you make that process more equitable? The Moon Treaty had provisions within it, but then almost all spacefaring nations are not treaty members of the Moon Agreement. So we probably need new regulation to deal with that particular future.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today. And of course, if you think of any other questions, you can always drop them in the chat or reach out. She'll be on social media, on LinkedIn. Thank you.
I have one last question when I got dropped in. May I join in?
If it's, I think we're okay because Tim's going to be wrapping things up. So if it's a quick question, we can just take one final question.
Yeah, that's fine. No, because I got brought in just now for a question. Hi, Doctor, how are you? It's Nino Marcantonio, and I really love what you're doing across the world. Would you be interested in talking about how you could support our forum at Office Secretary of Defense for policy space? It's so important what you're doing, your work to bring in this kind of conversations to the senior leadership that we have around these forums that we have created over the last 4 years. How would you like to support that? We can talk offline. I'm sorry, it's so late with the question.
So the way first of all, I'll have to have an idea of what the forum is going to be focused on. I think there are already interests, and you mean the Office of the Secretary of Defense, right, Nino? Is that what you mean? And the Pentagon?
Exactly right. Yes, we have already.
Okay. Yeah. So there are already, there are already forums that look at futures within the Pentagon. There are already those, but they're also looking at it from a very threat assessment perspective, right? But what is interesting, Nino, is that in the recent years, there is also a push by the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, to actually write on regulation and norms and responsible behavior in space as well, including for Space Force officers and flag officers that you mentioned. So a conversation around those issues, a conversation around what operational and what national security requirements are critical vis-a-vis what's happening in other countries. How do we ensure that while we utilize space for military command and control, communication, we do not weaponize space, which is a very critical, concern of mine. So yeah, I would be very interested in supporting such conversations, but I would want to know from you, how are you envisioning that idea? Which unit within the Pentagon you think you are reaching out to? And so,
Sure.
In spirit, it's a great idea.
I'll reach out to you and tell you all about that. Then we'll thank you for the time, and I'll be in contact with you via email. Okay.
Sure. And I'm on LinkedIn too, so feel free to connect, or if you're connected, just message me. Thank you.
Already connected. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah.
I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And Namrata, thank you so much for joining our conversation today. Such a great day, right? A lot of great topics coming out.